Friday meeting of the City Club of Portland. I'm Jim Westwood, your president. We'll begin, as always, by introducing new members. We have one of our new members in the audience today, and I'd like to ask her to stand and be recognized. Vicki Barrows, president of the Portland Association of Teachers, is with us. Welcome to City Club, Vicki. And thank you to Eva Parsons, who recruited Ms. Barrows as a new member. There are several guests in every audience we have on Friday, but today I'd like to mention four special guests we have seated in the audience today, and I'd like to ask them to stand briefly too after I've presented them. These are three board members and the executive director of the City Club of Seattle, who are here visiting to see how we do things and maybe to, I hope, find things that they do better that they can tell us about. Welcome very much to City Club. We're glad to have you. Please stand up so people can see you. Next Friday, August 2nd, we'll be returning to the Benson Hotel. For those of you in our radio audience, today we're broadcasting from the Hilton, so imagine the Hilton Ballroom. But Friday, August 2nd, political observers and analysts will speak on the triumphs and disappointments of the 66th Oregon Legislative Session in a program that's titled 1991 Legislative Report Card, Pass, Fail, or Incomplete. Or maybe I should say, did they get their initial certificate of mastery? Our speakers will be Jeff Mapes and Gail Kinsey-Hill, who are political reporters for the Oregonian, and Bill Lunch, political analyst for Oregon Public Broadcasting and an associate professor of political science at Portland State University. Again, please note that for next Friday, we return to the Benson Hotel Mayfair Room. Also, please note in this week's bulletin that the club's communications committee is seeking new members. If you have experience or an interest in communications, marketing, advertising, promotion, direct mail, or writing, did I exclude anything at all? Please call Donna Schaefer at the City Club office to apply. The Communications Committee fulfills a vital function. It's one of the standing committees of the City Club, and I urge anyone who is interested to apply for membership on the Communications Committee. June is the month in which the largest percentage of club membership renewals become due. And if June is your month to renew, and you got your notice and you haven't yet renewed, please do send in your dues. This is going to be a big year for City Club. We'll have a soon-to-be-released ethnic minorities study, actually in several parts, and the club's 4-week 75th anniversary comes up in September and October. So stay involved. The club needs you. If you're thinking of joining, this is a fine time to join. There's much coming up with City Club. Seated at the head table is Helen Lee at my far left, treasurer of the City Club and assistant vice president at First Interstate Bank. She is today's board host and will have the privilege of asking the first question of our speaker. The second question from the microphone at the floor will be asked by Teresa Lukowski-Clark, a member of the Government and Taxation Standing Committee. And as always, after the second question, we open up the meeting to questions from City Club members in the audience. I would include Seattle City Club members as our guests. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free. I think you're going to have plenty of questions that you'll want to ask, all of you, especially given the topic of our speaker today, so think of them as he is speaking. We also will have written questions. If you'd like to fill out the forms on your table and hold them up as our speaker finishes his prepared remarks, staff will collect those and bring them up to the head table, and we will ask those as time permits. On to our speaker. Well, as Andy Rooney might say, did you ever notice that when the newspaper runs a story on something you know a lot about from your own firsthand experience, there seems to be a lot wrong with the story? One of the jurors in the Frank Gable murder trial recently completed was quoted as saying that the trial she read about in the newspapers bore no relation to the trial that she had sat through as a juror. I suppose to its partial credit at least, it was the Oregonian that reported that quote, however. Our speaker today has a special vantage point from which to view and evaluate the news media. He is a journalist himself, clearly a very independent journalist. Norman Solomon is also an author. With Harvey Wasserman, he wrote a book titled Killing Our Own, The Disaster of America's Experience with Atomic Radiation. And last year, with Martin Lee, Mr. Solomon published Unreliable Sources, a guide to detecting bias in news media. Mr. Solomon has reported for Pacifica Radio National News, and he has been the Washington representative for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, a media watch organization. I should add that Mr. Solomon is a former Portlander and a community activist who lived here in the 70s and 80s. Two of the principal culprits in bringing about media bias, Mr. Solomon believes, are the corporate structures that own and advertise in the media and the government with which the media seem to go along too willingly. Well, such criticisms can have an unseemly tinge as well, to be sure. A friend of mine, a person of intellect and culture who happened to be Egyptian, once told me earnestly that the American media were indeed grossly unobjective, but her reason was that they were owned and run by Zionists. Well, a more acceptable bête noire may be a safer target, but bias in the media is something that many people share a view on for many different reasons. We can judge for ourselves whether Norman Solomon's outspoken views of media bias are on target, but he certainly does bring extensive documentation and a passionate interest to his subject, and City Club is pleased today to welcome him back to Portland and to have as its guest Mr. Norman Solomon.
It is very good to be here, and whenever I'm referred to as a media critic, I feel an impulse to immediately interject that some of my best friends are journalists. Certainly a lot of journalists are hardworking, they're dedicated, they have developed their skills, and they often are very perceptive. But increasingly, they work in a news industry that has about as much to do with independent reporting as Safeway has to do with family farming. They work within institutional constraints, and the problems are not nearly so much ones of individual bias as institutional biases and strictures and vested interests. Long ago, the media critic A.J. Liebling pointed out in his words that freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. We have learned in the decades since he made that comment just how powerful that reality has become. This is not the only large metropolitan city with one daily newspaper. It's small comfort that we have the best media that money can buy. And we have been conditioned to believe that censorship only exists when a commissar or a general or a dictator blue pencils and passes upon the editorials and the news reports. And one of the hidden realities, the denied realities, is that censorship can also come from corporate control, that the CEOs and managers are just as ready, willing, and able to block and constrict, and yes, sometimes twist the news to suit their purposes, just as willing and able to do that as any censor anywhere in the world. Our book documents cases, and there have been others since then, where the Today Show on NBC network, owned by General Electric, which as we know brings good things to life like light bulbs and nuclear bomb detonators and guidance missile systems. The Today Show killed reports or segments of reports that made unfavorable references to their parent company, General Electric. But we have been encouraged to equate a free press with a privately owned press, encouraged to believe that as long as our media are in private hands, we need have no fear. And this blind spot, which has been increased by the media frameworks, the media discussions themselves, has extended to the point that we no longer hear public discussion about a very crucial reality. The AM and FM radio band, the broadcast TV spectrum, those public resources, and they are public resources, ones which John Dewey and others struggled to safeguard in the 1930s, during the same era that the BPA was fought for and implemented. The corporate powers won that battle. The corporate powers hijacked our resources, our AM and FM radio, our broadcast television. I don't believe that that finite resource exists so it can be used as a cash cow for corporations like Cap City or tycoons like Lawrence Tisch, or mega international conglomerates like General Electric. The day may yet come when we will no longer tolerate, we would no more tolerate the hijacking and the ownership and the selling off of broadcast bands than we would selling off the Willamette or the Columbia by the cubic foot. In recent months, we got an eyeful of media bias. We saw the proof of the statement made long ago by an Austrian diplomat that wars begin when leaders lie and then believe their lies in the press. And I can't state with any assurance what those who implemented this war did or did not believe. That's an internal process. But I can say that the separation between press and state dwindled almost to the vanishing point once the first missiles were fired by the United States. It's a funny thing about all the extensive coverage. You would think, looking for all the different angles, the news media might include some points of relevance, for instance, that for weapons manufacturers, it was a very good war. It was a very good quarter. But this was a taboo. This would disrupt the patterns of denial that we know in the microcosm are so important to perpetuate abuse. And in the macrocosm, the TV networks and the major news media, with very rare exceptions, throughout the war and even afterwards, did not talk about the tremendous profits that were to be made by many, many corporations supplying the tools of the war trade to the U.S. military. One of those corporations, of course, was General Electric. General Electric was associated with the production or research or marketing of almost every single weapon system used by the United States in the war on Iraq. We didn't hear that acknowledgement. We didn't hear that disclaimer from Tom Brokaw. If legislators stand up in Salem and argue for or against public measures or try to affect the public perceptions, we would demand full disclosure. We would at least demand disclaimers if they had investments in corporations or industries that stood to gain or lose depending on public perceptions and government policy. And yet, no such disclaimers from Tom Brokaw. He didn't talk about the fact that the people who signed his paychecks had more profits every time the missiles were fired, every time the bodies were burned. The cruise missiles, the stealth bombers, the B-52s, the AWACS, the NavStar guidance systems, these were all GE products, a taboo topic. The media watch group that I work with, FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, did a study of the first 2 weeks of network coverage of the war. We identified 878 different sources quoted on the 3 major networks during the evening national news. Out of the 878, the number of national peace organization leaders quoted was 1. 1. The people who signed Tom Brokaw's paycheck had reason to be pleased. We might say, thank goodness for public broadcasting. Well, FAIR did a study of the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, and it was commissioned by FAIR and conducted by 2 sociologists at Boston College. And the findings, I think, were very telling. When the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour discussed international affairs and foreign policy issues, the guests, over a 6-month period, looking at the shows every night, the U.S. guests were 94% white, 94% male, and fully 67% present or former U.S. government officials. And the 2 out of 3 figure did not include representatives of the RAND Corporation and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who may never have drawn a government paycheck, but for all the diversity of their views, just may as well have. Is it a coincidence that since 1983, as we're reminded every weekday night, it has been brought to us, this program has been brought to us by AT&T, a major military contractor, and more recently as well, PepsiCo. We might say, well, the executives of these corporations don't march into the newsroom, they don't give directives. But the fact is that what is exercised is what we might call a positive veto. And they fund the programs that they believe are doing a good job. But there are many people in this country who might have a different idea of what a good job is. When 6 seats out of 100 are reserved for women, communicating, I suppose, that it's still supposed to be, when push comes to shove, a man's world out there, and apparently a white man's world at that. 6 seats out of 100 reserved for people of color. And whatever happened to separation between press and state? You know, a lot of the responses to the FAIR studies, and by the way, we did a similar study of several years of Nightline programs, and the statistics were almost exactly the same. Ted Koppel's guessed 89% male, 92% white. And the response from Koppel and McNeil and Lehrer and their producers, the response has been very uniform. Don't blame us because white male conservatives are in power. That's what we're reflecting. No more, no less. If we had a left-wing government, we'd have domination of the media by left-wingers. Well, it had a familiar ring to it as a rationale. It's not a bad rationale if you believe the Fourth Estate should function as a fourth branch of government. It's not a bad rationale if you feel that the primary responsibility of a journalist is to mirror the picture that certain people in power want to project, if their role is to serve as mouthpieces for the powers that be. But it was a very familiar rationale because I'd heard it in the Soviet Union when I visited there and spoke with journalists before Glasnost. And in 1991, in a very real sense, we're still waiting for Glasnost to arrive in the United States. Then, of course, on public broadcasting, there's a widely watched program once a week, Washington Week in Review, where the same journalists that we've been reading in the national press all week get to exchange their conventional wisdoms across the table for our edification. I think perhaps the name of the show should be changed to White Washington Week in Review. And wouldn't you know it, the sponsors, or I think the operative euphemism is underwriters of that show, are Ford and Ford Aerospace. My impression of corporations is that they tend to like to get what they pay for. If they don't like what they're subsidizing, they tend to not subsidize it anymore. But just as with AT&T and PepsiCo, I think Ford and Ford Aerospace have a lot of reason to be satisfied. And by the way, in this city, there is now an assault on cable access to television. And I lived in Portland during the 70s when people, as I recall, like Connie McCready and others, worked very hard and sifted out a lot of community input to establish cable television and cable access. And there was a pledge made to people in this community that when cable systems were put in place, there would be community access, and that would be guaranteed, and there would be facilities made available for people to use. And wouldn't you know it, some years down the line, those corporations are doing everything they can to renege on those pledges, not to renew, to cut back, to scale back on the access. And apparently the white noise of the mass media isn't quite white enough, and there are corporate pressures to filter out even the occasional diversity, such as what has been sometimes seen on television. And I think that's a reality of news media, whether we're talking about a metropolitan area or nationally. What might be called white noise. kind of like, you turn on the TV too late at night or too early in the morning, and sometimes you get that test pattern in the audio track. It's like, wah. Or a boiler in the basement that just has a steady buzz. Sure, it's loud, maybe. You can't accuse news media in this country, such as television, of being silent. There's a lot of volume. But how much variation, how much diversity is involved? You might say, in general, the mass media, with few exceptions, give us discussions of public issues and private concerns that run the gamut from A to B or A to C. But there's a whole rest of a conceptual alphabet, so to speak, that is ruled out, a whole universe of ideas that never makes it through the filtration process. At the national level, with programs like Nightline, I call it the Kissinger-Hague disease, the golden Rolodex, the Rolodex syndrome, the wheel of guests, where people like Henry Kissinger and Al Haig are heard from again and again and again and again. And other voices are drowned out by this white noise, because that's one of the roles and functions and impacts of white noise, is it makes it difficult to get other words in edgewise. But there's a second way in which we get white noise from the news media. It's dominated overwhelmingly by Caucasians. White noise over and over again. A perspective that we're now seeing enforced. The attack on multiculturalism. And what a great fraud the media campaign about political correctness has been the last few months. We hear and see George Will, for instance, fulminating about political correctness. And neither he nor the other people leading the charge, carrying the spears for the corporate chieftains, we don't hear them acknowledge that the real powerful enforcers of political correctness, of ruling out and preventing voices from being heard that are divergent, the real political correctness, the PC gendarmes, more than any others, are the corporate news media. They are the ones who determine what ideas can be heard and will be heard by the mass public of the United States, and which ones will be blocked at the gate and never allowed to run the course at all. And I haven't read or heard where George Will complains about the propaganda system that puts him on TV week after week, puts him on the op-ed pages week after week, and leaves so many other voices out. And by the way, and this is, I guess, a bit of a digression, but I had an interesting experience. A couple years back, I was doing some writing with Dr. Helen Caldicott, and we were talking about the possibility of her writing an op-ed column that could be syndicated. And as it happens, I talked to the managing editor of one of the major syndicates for op-ed opinion page articles. And I was told that Dr. Caldicott was too far left for syndication, because it seemed that many editorial page editors would consider her just a left-winger and too far beyond the bounds of reasonable discussion. And yet, these are the same op-ed editors and the same narrow system of syndicates that syndicate people like Patrick Buchanan. Patrick Buchanan, who has written a couple of years ago that General Francisco Franco of Spain and General Augusto Pinochet of Chile were, quote, soldier patriots, unquote. Someone who has written that AIDS is a punishment from God. Here is someone who is not too far right for mass national syndication and appearance on the daily newspaper editorial pages. And when I think about the white noise that keeps reverberating from the mass media, with few exceptions, I think of what Martin Luther King said shortly before his death, when he spoke about the Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach and nothing to learn from the rest of the world. We have news media, by and large, providing stenography services for the powers that be, rather than real journalism. You know, we have this phrase, investigative journalism, and it should be a redundancy. It should be like saying wet water, because journalism is supposed to be assertive, aggressive, independent, yes, investigative. But we need this adjective, investigative journalism, to distinguish the occasional instances from the routine, passive, obsequious stenography to power that typifies what masquerades as journalism. The reliance on official sources is commonplace, it's cheap, it's neat, it's efficient, and those who own the operation have much reason to be pleased. I want to quote someone who wasn't exactly your Marxist-Leninist. His name was Dwight Eisenhower. He referred to the military-industrial complex. And Dwight Eisenhower uttered a phrase that has rarely been heard in recent years in the news media. If you would use that phrase, you might be considered outside the game of the players who are important to get center stage in national debate. It's kind of like another term we don't hear very much, antitrust. You know, it has that kind of antique sound to it. I'd suggest we might want to add another hyphen and call it the military-industrial media complex. Increasingly, that complex is not just mouthpieces for vested interests. They are themselves vested interests, not only the General Electrics, but the Times Mirror Corporation, which owns so many papers, including the LA Times, and owns so many trees, and owns so much land, and has so much of a vested interest in water policy throughout the West. But the news media that are supposed to be our watchdogs against such truly special interests function much more like lapdogs. And quite often in the National Press Corps, they're on a very short leash from the Oval Office. They may nip at the heels at times, but when push comes to shove, and for instance, when the flag goes up and the troops go out and the orders are given, they pretty much salute like buck privates. And when the dogs of war run up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, they are very, very thin reeds against mass destruction. With all the talk about war to safeguard peace, those dogs of war, when they're asked to jump in the press corps, asked to jump by the White House, they of course don't ask why, they ask more, how high? People in Iraq learned about the implications of the current health of our fourth estate in this country. And a lot of it, I think, might be described as linguicide. Linguicide being the steady destruction of language as an instrument of meaning. So, for instance, a few days after the war began, Time magazine defined, quote, collateral damage, unquote, as, quote, a term meaning dead or wounded civilians who should have picked a safer neighborhood, unquote. It's also linguicide when the news media parrot U.S. government statements that describe a regime like the Saudi government as a, quote, moderate, unquote, government. That kind of a description would surely surprise the hundreds of political prisoners inside Saudi jails who are being tortured for their political beliefs. An interesting concept that your torturers are moderates. Definitions of human rights embraced by the news media correlate closely to those of the State Department and the White House. Those definitions, and most importantly, that coverage, is policy-driven. And so it was as well when the war was being reported, and repeatedly the cruise missiles that were hitting in Iraq in places like Baghdad and Basra, they were described as technological marvels. But the Scud missiles that were landing in Israel, they were described as weapons of terror. How are we to reconcile these two different descriptions? Thousands of missiles, taking many, many thousands of lives, and of course they continue to take lives with typhoid and cholera and other diseases in the aftermath of the war as we are here today. How do we reconcile that those cruise missiles were technological marvels, as described by our news media, but those few Scud missiles that took a few lives, in truth, I think, equally terroristic as the U.S. missiles, they, and only they, the Scud missiles, were described as weapons of terror being used by a terrorist government. Once linguicide is put into effect, all kinds of atrocities become possible. The linguicide, the media bias, is as essential to making war as the bombs and the bullets and the missiles. And so it is as well, I think, that the mass media of this country encourage us to whistle past a nuclear graveyard in which truly billions of graves have already been plotted. I know from the years of living in this community in the 1970s and most of the 1980s that the problems are everywhere, including here. The Oregonian newspaper for so many years, encouraged us to whistle past the graveyard known as Hanford, to downplay the local hazard and the global threat. And even today, the problems are understated, because that is a proving ground for global annihilation. And when we call it modernization, that's more newspeak, which Orwell would understand. That's more linguicide. You notice how other countries can build up and escalate their arsenals, but we modernize ours. And the local hazard and the global threat represented by Hanford is still understated, as I would contend, and have joined with many people in contending for many, many years, that the Trojan nuclear plant also has its dangers vastly understated by the mass media in the Northwest. The dangers are much more real, short and long term than we are encouraged to believe. And it's also linguicide to talk about a deterrent, but only when the missiles are pointed away from the United States. And I have yet to find any mass media report that refers to the Soviet nuclear arsenal pointed in this direction as a deterrent. It seems that those nuclear missiles and nuclear technology itself has an ideological content, and they are only constructive, only deterrents when they're pointed by this country elsewhere, not the other way around. Well, everything I've said, much of it can be responded to by saying, well, I just saw a story the other day that is very different. And perhaps that's the case. But the essence of propaganda is not the exception, which is by definition exceptional. The essence of propaganda is repetition. The drumbeat of code words and catchphrases and skewed and subjective frames of references projected as though they were reality, they were fairness itself, they were balance. We've been conditioned to confuse what is familiar with what is unbiased, to confuse what is customary with what is fair. If tomorrow we picked up the Oregonian and it wasn't skewed to suit the likes of the mega chain called Newhouse, we would be very startled. Many of us might think that something had gone on very wrong at the Oregonian. For instance, what if we picked up the Oregonian and not only was there a section devoted to business, but there was also a section devoted to labor. This is a small example, and it's not only the Oregonian, it's virtually every metropolitan daily newspaper in this country. A small example of the bias that is so customary that we don't give it a second thought. Day after day, sections devoted to business, the outlooks for the next quarter, the views and perspectives of the CEOs, etc., etc., but no labor sections. We could certainly fill labor sections with good journalism. We could talk about working conditions, environmental hazards on the job, access to health care, cutbacks on coverage of workers, child care, how layoffs affect people. I interviewed a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and he was quite outspoken, as many journalists are, although usually it's not for attribution. And he said, the nation's press writes their business pages from the viewpoint of bankers, not from the viewpoint of bank customers. The media conditioning, and TV is a very dramatic example. It conditions us, encourages us to be passive about almost everything except going out and buying things. Authentic communication is tightly limited, and if I were interested in continuing the status quo, I would certainly want to limit the range of discussion and authentic communication. It's not parallel discussion, it's not horizontal discussion. It's very vertical, it's blockaded, it's filtered through a centralized source of information, or misinformation, or disinformation, what's been called infotainment, and Paul Krasner has coined a new word called disinfotainment. The implications of all this we live with, and we live with it constantly. When communication is so chronically blocked, authentic and real communication, and myths and false pretenses take their place, then a lot of dysfunction becomes routine. And we've all been hearing quite often, I think, discussions of late about dysfunctional families and dysfunctional small working units, and what costs are paid financially and in terms of health and well-being and emotional strength. What costs are paid because of the dysfunction that takes place when people do not communicate clearly with each other about really what is going on, about what their real concerns are. And of course, denial is often part of that. Often there are abusive situations where denial holds sway. And I think that there are real parallels nationally. And in a sense, the news media are a system of dysfunctional communication or non-communication. And I hasten to add that these systems, while they are dysfunctional, they're also highly functional in a certain sense. I mean, if I was a major shareholder of General Electric, I might think that the news media were quite functional. If I was very wealthy, I might consider the society to be very functional on an economic basis. That, of course, depends on one's perception. But part of the fabric of the true dysfunction in human terms, I think, is really woven with these threads of denial. We know in the microcosm, but I think discuss it far less in the macrocosm, that the patterns of abuse that are around us, they require silence about their true nature. And I think it's a challenge for all of us as individuals in our own minds and hearts, in our own families and workplaces, in our communities. It's a real challenge for us to break the silences, first with ourselves, and then also in the process with our communities. Because part of the change needs to come from speaking what has previously been considered to be unspeakable or improper or has been discounted by dysfunctional media systems. One of the real tragedies of those networks of denial, and in a real sense, I think, every evening when the network news is on television and 29 million families watch, 29 million households watch, it's kind of like a national dinner table where certain topics are not allowed, where certain truths cannot be spoken, where certain people around that dinner table with great power and often abusively used power, such as the President of the United States. But these are taboo topics to talk about the wealth that has a relationship to the poverty. Think that these patterns of abuse, of dysfunction, of denial in our news media encourage us to lie to each other about the nature of our society, and probably most importantly, try to condition us and often have the effect of conditioning us to lie to ourselves. And that certainly would be a final victory for the military-industrial media complex. Well, in closing, I'd like to note that what's at stake is almost every issue that you care about. The poverty in this city and around the country and around the world has a lot to do with denial, which reinforces a system of abuse. According to Oxfam, in the next 24 hours, 60,000 people will die in the world of hunger, 2/3 of them children. The amount spent on weapons in 1 minute could feed 2,000 malnourished children for a year. We don't have to go very far, though, to see the downside of this marketplace of ideas, the de facto system of $1, one vote for mass media, in which what I think can be called morally criminal activities by huge institutions are presented as normal and proper. When news media talk about the poor, they don't simultaneously talk about the rich, and vice versa. The causality is severed. We're encouraged to pretend that there's no causality, no relationship between the two. Many journalists are taught at the outset, at least in school and in theory, that it's a responsibility of the journalistic profession to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And yet, in practice, I'm afraid that often becomes inverted. And the mass media function much more to afflict the already afflicted and to comfort the already too comfortable. I'd like to close by suggesting just a few moments of silence for all of those near and far who have suffered from the results of these patterns that enmesh our society and ourselves, the patterns of denial and deceit that remain with us so powerfully and so destructively. Hopefully we'll all, many more of us, will be learning more about a process that a labor organizer described long ago as follows: mourn the dead and fight like hell for the living.
Mark Twain once said, I try never to pick an argument with a man who buys his ink by the barrel. Mr. Solomon does so, and I think society is the better for it. For the first question of Mr. Solomon, since he has invited a discussion, I hope it will be a lively one. Our board host today, Helen Lee.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You talked about setting the limits of rational debate, and I wonder, with reference to cable access productions, assuming we're able to continue that, what restrictions should be placed? The example before us is whether the Tom Metzgers of the world should be allowed to use community access television to promote racial hatred.
I didn't notice that there were any restrictions on the Willie Horton ads in 1988. It's kind of parallel to what Woody Guthrie said about some rob you with a six gun and now with a fountain pen. In King Lear, Shakespeare talked about if you put virtue in rags, the pygmy's straw doth pierce it, but clothe it in gold and it's impossible to break through. I would submit that there is a lot of institutional racism in the news media all the time. And I don't think that the First Amendment has a lot of ifs, ands, or buts in it. And I think that we ought to condemn racism everywhere we find it and do so very vocally. The real threat to us is not the exercise of free speech, but the abdication of the use of free speech by those of us who want to create a world that sustains and respects human life instead of attacking it and degrading it. A very difficult question in terms of the First Amendment, but I would hate to see the day when we call it the First Half Amendment. I think the whole thing is a pretty good deal.
The Oregon affiliate of the public broadcasting system chose not to air a document about black homosexuals called Tongues Untied, even though a local critic said that there was nothing in it he wouldn't allow his 12-year-old son to see. Why does the local PBS affiliate have the power to censor, and what can we do?
Well, it kind of goes back to what A.J. Liebling said about freedom of the press guaranteed to those who own it. Freedom of the airwaves belongs to those who own or at least control the airwaves. In that case, I mean, here's an example where the news media have just gone through a negative and murderous orgy of glorifying something that was called a war, which was a massacre in which perhaps 150,000 people were killed in 6 weeks, perhaps as many as 100,000 civilians in that time. That is not defined as obscenity. The denial that shows blips on a screen to represent human beings, that is not considered obscenity, but something that talks about the lives and experiences of people who are dealing with oppression and invalidation. The idea that that, therefore, is obscene and not fit for viewing, I think that skews the priorities. And in the case of this documentary, it goes to show, even in the so-called non-commercial broadcast realm, how powerful are the forces that want to keep the tongues tied. You know, I mean, metaphorically and literally, this tongues untied stuff has got to be stopped. You know, people are supposed to go back into the closet. Many people feel that women should relearn their place, which is ordained by others. And this is a powerful pressure that's being exerted. And I think those of us who have different values and argue for pluralism and human rights at home need to fight back.
How do they fight back? That's what I want to know.
Well, I mean, I believe we should stop sending in money to pay for propaganda systems. I mean, if are you saying that PBS did not air that?
Correct.
Well, I think we should stop sending them checks, frankly, until they get themselves together. There are a lot of other deserving community projects and alternative media that need support, and let's stop just writing checks no matter what kind of censorship exists. Because make no mistake, that's censorship. And if that was being done in the Soviet Union, we would hear about it in our news media in rather outraged tones.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gretchen Biener, also of the Government and Taxation Committee. The line between commentary by reporters and quote-unquote objective reporting has, of course, as you've said, become very blurred. What kind of standards would you suggest be imposed within the network media system to at least make the difference known to the general public?
Yeah, I think one thing that would help would be to lessen the pretentiousness of the news media. You know, when you pick up the New York Times and on the front left-hand corner of the top front page it says all the news that's fit to print, or what Walter Cronkite used to say, and that's the way it is. Well, that isn't the way it is. It's the way certain editors in powerful positions decided to present the news. And I think a lot of this tension around objectivity, which I think is rather a myth. We can have hopefully fairness and some balance, but objectivity is mythological. A lot of the tension around it has to do with the pretentiousness that here are these people at the Oregonian who tell us the way the world really was in the last 24 hours. And of course, that's nonsense. And there are literally thousands of identifiable, subjective decisions that are made every day before a newspaper goes to press. And if we can be more candid about that, that would help. I think also breaking up the media trust would be useful too, so that we could spread the dialogue around and not have the media hogged, so to speak, by a narrow range of interests.
Thank you.
I'm Marcia Slappy, City Club member. And before I ask my question, I want to tell you I spent 18 years at the Voice of America. You and I could have a lot of discussion, that's for sure. And before that, I was in television, so we'll get to the image consultants. The person says, now you know, the way I look now, I wouldn't be persona grata on TV. But the image consultants are there to raise the ratings for the advertising dollar. Do you think they have any influence beyond that as far as news is concerned?
Well, often the question comes up, for instance, who is better, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, Dan Rather? I kind of would compare that to a question like, what do you think's better, Camels, Winstons, or Salems? You know,
That's not kind.
The packaging can vary. It may appeal to certain tastes. Some may be a bit less deadly than others, you know, the tar and nicotine content, but...
I think I meant more the beauty of the species.
Oh, yeah, well, you know, women are generally discouraged from aging on television, which I notice...
And everywhere else, I mean...
Somehow it's okay for men. You know, I have a feeling I know who writes those rules, written or unwritten. Yeah, a lot of that image stuff, and I think that goes along with the general pattern that appearances are what matter. I mean, you know, you talk about the society, it's kind of things get spruced up. We are supposed to evaluate situations by the imagery, not the reality, and I think to break through the dysfunction, we're going to have to spend less time on image making and more on creating a reality that we're comfortable with.
I think that's the audience that decrees that. It really is.
Well, it's somewhat of a chicken or an egg problem, and unfortunately corporations largely own the chicken and the egg at this point. And I think that's a struggle because the tastes are acquired, and you know, there's, not to demean us Homo sapiens, but there are experiments with little rats where if you feed them sugared water from birth, they will prefer sugared water. It doesn't mean it's good for them. And I think we can learn to create differently and create a different reality. I mean, people in Los Angeles may be used to their air. It doesn't speak well for the oxygen content.
Thank you.
Jim Thayer, City Club member. First of all, I'd like to thank City Club for presenting us with such an eloquent spokesman for diversity. I think it's a nice change. Norman, you spoke about some exceptions in terms of the bias you found in the U.S. press. Perhaps you might enlighten us some of the good spots that you find in reporting in this country and some of the areas that you feel are laudable. And then in a second sort of aside, you've made your inferences have been that private ownership of media is leading in the wrong direction and perhaps influences unduly. In Europe today, we see a mass flight away from publicly owned stations into the cable networks, partly because the pablum presented by the state-owned networks is so predictable and so mainstream. How do you deal with that as a model or as a failure of a model, i.e. the public ownership versus the private ownership?
Yeah. Well, on the second point, I think the ownership per se doesn't assure you of anything. I mean, the BBC is not privately owned. If you tuned in during the Gulf War to the BBC, it was perhaps even more hawkish than National Public Radio, which is really saying something. At the same time, you have some public media that do better job than others, but in general, when the resources are so finite in terms of who's going to dominate the airwaves, for instance, especially broadcast media, it's a real problem. Alvin Toffler wrote in the Third Wave book, published about 10 years ago, that cable technology was going to be a great savior for us because it was going to do what he called demassify the media, decentralize. Opinions were going to become more diverse because communication channels were going to become more diverse. And I think he was exactly wrong. We've seen Financial News Network just bought by GE. Many of the national cable systems are bought by the same people who brought us broadcast television, and that's the trend of concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. You know, the corporations larger in size and fewer in number, controlling more and more of what we get. So I think it's going to be a running battle, and in the 1930s, John Dewey and others tried to get through Congress a provision to set aside a quarter of the radio band for nonprofit public interest groups, and the broadcasters beat that back. And I think we may want to revive some of those proposals. I just want to add that CNN, although it's heralded here as so enlightened because they don't use or try not to use the word foreign in their broadcast because they're so international, in Europe, when I was in Spain a couple of months ago and talked to a number of journalists who feel that it's a form of imperial media, that CNN is very US-centric and has that kind of a perspective that they project onto the world and try largely to impose on the cable viewing audience elsewhere. On the first point, I think there are some good signs, but they tend to not be from the hugely lucrative large corporations. I mean, I could go into stories about perhaps the best chain of the country, Knight Ridder, and the deterioration and their publication in Boca Raton, Florida, of a daily newspaper that makes USA Today look like the New York Times, you know. So this is a trend line. At the same time, there are independent media, and we have here in this community many strong efforts that are going on and around the state and the country. Radio station like KBOO, the Alliance newspaper, other periodicals that really, against great odds, keep coming out regularly and doing their work, and I think we need to support that. It doesn't mean that they print or broadcast the gospel. What it does mean is they're trying to get some words in edgewise to the dominant paradigms.
Thank you.
Bill Frank, City Club member. You've been very critical of the ownership structure of a good part of our media, and you did make some disparaging comments about General Electric owning NBC and the Newhouse chain owning the Oregonian. I think it's a fact of life that it takes a lot of capital and wherewithal to support these various areas of the media. I know I would have a tough time, maybe even you would, paying the payroll this afternoon of the 500 or so employees of the Oregonian. What is your solution to the ownership situation?
Well, I'd love to be in a position to write their payroll checks if I could. Long term, I think we're going to need to challenge those prerogatives. What does it mean when the First Amendment can stay the law of the land and be on the books, but have it gutted in spirit? It's a very difficult problem. I think it's easier to define with broadcast media because simply the airwaves have been hijacked by people who have expropriated that public resource, and we need to expropriate it back and take it back. So I would favor taking broadcast air space, the AM and FM band, broadcast television, VHF and UHF, I would take it away from the corporations. I mean, I wouldn't want to sell off Mount Hood by the foot or the rivers and waterways. Oregon's been a leader in protecting the beaches and access to the coastline, and I think we ought to apply some similar standards to finite broadcast resources. Print media is a tougher problem because they have a First Amendment to try to feather their own nests and expand their corporate empires. And incidentally, it's extremely lucrative in general to have a newspaper chain, and many chains look to local dailies that they own for very, very hefty returns on investment. 15, 20, 35% is an unknown. Very impressive. And so they're not, I don't think, doing us any kind of favor. On the contrary, they're stultifying the air and limiting the debate, and I think we need to try to deal with them as we would impediments in other realms of our lives.
Greg Noak, City Club member. Okay, I'm coming out of the closet. I work for the Oregonian, right? But I have a serious question. During the Gulf War, there was a great deal of censorship of the war coverage. First part of that, if the press is on such a short leash, why did Washington care so much about the censorship? The second part of that, a number of us protested quite stridently against the censorship. Polls showed that not only did 80% of the American public agree with the censorship, they wanted more censorship. Okay, we can question numbers and we can question polls. Here in Portland at the Oregonian, our own experience bore that out. We ran a picture and a story on page 1 at the time one of the U.S. missiles hit an Iraqi shelter and anywhere from 300 to 500 people were killed. We had virtually nonstop telephone calls the next day protesting that, saying we were carrying Iraqi propaganda. So in your speech, you said that we're still waiting for glasnost in the media here. Well, if 80% of the public wants more censorship, how do we know that we're getting glasnost, or that people want glasnost in the media?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, people have learned what is proper in the news media from the news media themselves, and 15 editors in Washington for the largest news media in the country sent a letter to Dick Cheney in May protesting the media censorship restrictions of the Pentagon. Not a single one of those news organizations, including the New York Times and Washington Post and the networks, not a single one joined in the lawsuit initiated at the start of the war to overturn those regulations. And I think the evidence is that the news media, including the networks, went along to get along with the Pentagon. It was a very convenient scapegoat to blame the Pentagon for all the self-censorship that went on during the war by the news media themselves. There was no government restriction that forced the networks to limit the access to the airwaves to people who were generals and others supporting the war. There was no Pentagon restriction that required that they have a total of 1 out of 878 sound bites and quotes, only 1 out of all of that number being leaders of a peace group. So I would argue that although many journalists, as you say, were genuinely distressed by the censorship, in point of fact, when it came down to policy and conduct of the news organizations, they used it as a scapegoat, and it was kind of a camouflage for their own self-censorship, which was voluntarily imposed. And of course, the government does care what the media do, and as long as the media are going to self-regulate, then they've got the best of both worlds in the Pentagon. They can impose some restrictions and count on the editors to do the rest of the job for them. There are exceptions. The media wasn't 100%, but as I mentioned, the essence of propaganda is not the exception. It's the drumbeat, the code word, the catchphrase, and the preponderance of the coverage, which in this case of the war was absolutely overwhelming as a dirge and a parade in favor of the massacres that took place.
Our time has expired, and then some. We did indeed have a good discussion. I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions, but we want to thank you again, Norman Solomon.